G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Anybody got any idea what this is? It's a museum piece. It's a door. It's a hatch. It's the inside of the door on an American Apollo command capsule. And it's in the Smithsonian Institute. Museum pieces. Relics of when America used to go to the moon. Now, I know some people get a bit cranky with me for suggesting that Ho Chi Minh ethnically cleansed the moon of all Americans, but the fact is 1969 was NASA's biggest ever year when they launched 3 moon rockets. In 1969, NASA's annual budget would have run the US Department of Defense for 3 days. 1 moon rocket, 1 day's US Department of Defense spending. If they'd spent half the money on B-52s, submarines, tanks, nuclear missiles, nuclear warheads, casualties in Vietnam, if they'd spent half the money on that, they could have had 167 moon rockets in 1969. So yeah, Ho Chi Minh ethnically cleansed the moon of all Americans. And between Sad Man Who's Insane and Osama bin Laden, America seems to have been pretty much shot out of low Earth orbit as far as manned launches are concerned, and it's really losing the race on satellite launches too. Here on page 12, update, touchdown, and the crowd goes wild. Last October, Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser spaceplane made its first free flight approach and landing test at Edwards Air Force Base, California. The 7-passenger reusable vehicle, an entry in NASA's Commercial Crew Integrated Capability Program, was released from an Erickson Air Crane helicopter, and it relied on its automated flight control system to steer it to the intended glide slope. Despite a last-minute glitch with the left main landing gear, okay, so it's done a 1/3 belly landing, the Dream Chaser touched down on the runway centerline a minute later, and they're captioning that the Dream Chaser lowers its gear to land. So they're putting every possible positive spin on it. But we also have a lead article. 2 photographs say a lot about the US space program. In 1996, NASA picked its biggest class of astronauts, the 44-member Sardines above, to take on the job of building the International Space Station. The newest class, opposite, is also the smallest. With missions uncertain, the 8-member 8 balls will go to space in the Orion capsule eventually. They hope. Astronauts waiting for a ride. Now that the space shuttle's gone, what do astronauts do? Last August, at a ceremony at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, NASA introduced its 8 newest astronaut candidates. NASA Administrator Charles Bolden and Centre Director Ellen Ochoa, both former astronauts, welcomed the new arrivals with rosy predictions for long and varied careers that would include flights to the International Space Station on a new American-made commercial spacecraft beginning in 2017, as well as missions beyond Earth orbit in the Orion multi-purpose crew vehicle. Latest class is the smallest group NASA has chosen since 1969, and behind the high fives and backslaps at their introduction lies a stark reality for every astronaut, rookie or veteran. Each year until 2017 there will be only 4 chances to fly. Instead of the handful of seats available each time when the space shuttles were flying 3 to 4 missions a year, the quarterly Soyuz launches to the International Space Station have only 1 seat reserved for a US astronaut, as long as Obama doesn't irritate Putin over Ukraine. To regain at least some of the capacity lost when NASA retired the space shuttle, the agency is funding development of 3 competing space designs: Boeing's CST-100, SpaceX's Dragon and Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser. This year the agency hopes to select 2 of the 3. But if the money is there, the vehicles can be judged safe enough, and if they can be launched on time, if, former astronaut Clay Anderson, who left NASA in January 2013 to teach aerospace engineering at Iowa State University, is sceptical. Quote, every program I was involved with at NASA for 30 years missed the advertised date considerably, he says. Anderson doesn't believe commercial firms can do any better. Quote, I would have kept the shuttle flying 1 to 2 flights per year while the commercial folks got their acts together and proved that they could safely deliver humans to and from orbit, he says. As for Orion, an unmanned early version of the vehicle is scheduled to launch aboard a Delta IV rocket this fall, but its future and that of the Space Launch System booster, indeed of all missions beyond Earth orbit, including retrieval of an asteroid, are far from certain. Out of here. Starting about 4 years ago, such uncertainties about the future of the manned space program triggered an astronaut exodus that continues to this day. When Randy Bresnik arrived at JSC in 2004, he says, quote, there were 135 of us. As of August 2013, there were 47. Where did everybody go? Some are still working for NASA as program managers, others took jobs at different federal agencies, and a handful joined academia. Several retired to join the companies building the commercial spacecraft that will carry the ones who stayed. Michael Foale, who flew on 6 shuttle missions, left for a dream project to develop an electric aeroplane. Rick C.J. Sturkow, a 4-mission veteran, left last spring to join Virgin Galactic as a test pilot for Spaceship Two, which will take paying passengers on suborbital flights. The final straw for some astronauts was the 2010 cancellation of the Constellation program, which was to send astronauts back to the Moon and eventually to Mars. 7-time shuttle flyer Jerry Ross, who retired from NASA in January 2012 after 33 years at the agency, recalls the frustration inside the astronaut office over, quote, the lack of overall direction within the agency and the nation, he says. There's no big exciting goal. No constellation with its suite of new vehicles that were going to take us back to the Moon and then on to Mars, unquote. Chris Ferguson, who in 2011 commanded the last shuttle flight and now works for Boeing, says simply, quote, my old job doesn't exist anymore. In fact, the job has gotten tougher. Every astronaut now has to learn Russian, face more stringent medical requirements to fly extended missions on the station, develop skills for spacewalking, and become an expert in robotics. Quote, with shuttle crews of 5, 6, even 7, you could have crew members who were really specialists in either EVA, extravehicular activity, spacewalking, or robotics, and maybe not so much in other areas, says Bresnik. Not with station. You've got to be more generalist than a specialist. Expert, not just on EVA and robotics, but also on science. You've got to be able to lift up the hood and fix the engine, or the waste management system. The demanding nature of space station expeditions is one reason that NASA continues to recruit astronauts, maintaining a head count of 55 even though the opportunities to fly are limited. The training is so complex and demanding that it lasts from 2.5 to 3 years, so at any given time there are a dozen astronauts in training to fly and work on the station in what NASA calls lines. For an astronaut who can qualify as a Soyuz second-seater or a flight engineer, the other is a backup for Russian, European, Japanese or Canadian scheduled for the third seat. Half a dozen more astronauts are in preliminary training for these assignments, brushing up on their language or spacewalking skills, for example. Still, that adds up to only around 20. What are the rest doing? What astronauts have been doing since the Mercury program, helping to develop the hardware and systems they operate in space. Veteran astronaut Randy Bresnik wiggles into a comfortable position in a fit test of Boeing's CST-100 spacecraft in Houston last summer. Testing the hardware they may fly is one of the astronauts' key duties while they wait to be assigned to a mission. So they're sort of human crash dummies. Check the fit, make sure the instrument panel's in the right place. The office. Astronauts are assigned to one or more of 5 branches in the astronaut office. The station branch deals with support for current and future missions, medical issues and ISS crew operations. The EVA robotics branch choreographs spacewalks and schedules tasks that require the use of the station's robotic arm. The training branch oversees the new astronaut candidates. The Soyuz branch involves astronauts in the design reviews of the vehicle as it continues to evolve. And the exploration branch, the largest, focuses on the cockpit design, habitability and operations of the commercial spacecraft and Orion capsule, as well as the engineering requirements for the new Space Launch System. The Chief Deputy and Branch Chiefs add another dozen astronauts to the total. Some positions in the branches are filled by astronauts who also have management positions outside the astronaut office. And that complicates the head counting, as does the fact that most astronauts have several jobs. Randy Bresnik, for example, has a primary assignment in the exploration branch as the astronaut rep for SpaceX, but he has additional duties in the EVA robotics branch and recently took part in tests to see how spacesuited astronauts fit inside a mock-up of the CST-100. In addition, he just gave up public astronaut appearances in order to train as a Capcom capsule communicator for the station. Robert Handley's major area is in station systems integration, where we deal with utilisation of the station's science experiments, blah, 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 blah. You can get the picture, right? The first shall be first. Several years ago, JSC Flight Crew Operations Directorate studied astronaut staffing in the light of flight opportunities and training requirements, as well as mission support and even career and lifestyle issues. And a 2011 National Academy of Sciences panel confirmed its findings. For the next 5 years or so, the two bodies concluded the ideal number of astronauts is 55. With 47 active astronauts and the 8 newly selected candidates, that is just what NASA has now. How many missions will be divided among them depends in part on what mode of transportation the astronauts will take to the station. There is the, quote, rental car mode, unquote, in which NASA buys a mission from a company and crews the flight entirely with astronauts. And there is the, quote, taxi, unquote, in which NASA buys a flight and assigns 3 to 4 astronauts but uses company employees for the 2 pilots. Quote, you can guess which one is the most popular around here, jokes Robert Handley, Benkin's technical deputy. Once that's worked out, the Chief Astronaut Office will determine the order of flight assignments. Management quite rightly wants to get unflown astronauts into space, Ross says, which also lengthens the line for veterans. And if you're a woman, the line is even longer. NASA's standards for cumulative radiation exposure are 20% more stringent for women than for men, mostly because of their additional risk of getting breast, ovarian or uterine cancers. That means women will fly only 45 to 50% of the missions men will fly. Former Chief Astronaut Peggy Whitson told an Institute of Medicine workshop last July, quote, I think that the current standards are too confining for exposure limits because I think it limits careers more than necessary, she told the workshop. Unquote. With astronaut careers projected to allow for at most 2 flights over the next decade, that's a serious loss of flight opportunities. For members of the class of 2013, there's one final obstacle to a mission assignment. There's the class of 2009 ahead of them, says Benkin. To make sure the newbies got the message, the 9 men and women of that class who bear the name Chumps christened the latest group the 8 Balls, after the game of pool that requires players to take their turn. In their group are 2 test pilots, Air Force and Navy, an Army helicopter pilot, a Marine flight test engineer, an Army flight surgeon, and 3 scientists, an oceanographer, a physicist, and an oceanographer physician. Those 8 will likely wait 5 or 7 years for a mission, and they were warned. Quote, I actually spoke to most of the new folks during the first and second rounds of interviews, Benkin says. Those he missed heard about the challenges of the job from veterans like Bresnik, and until astronauts actually get to fly in space, Benkin, the boss says, everyone will have plenty of meaningful work to do. For the 8 Balls, that means going through the standard astronaut candidate training, an evaluation course which includes survival training in Maine, familiarisation with NASA's fleet of T-38 trainer aircraft, and an introduction to the station's systems, EVA robotics and Russian language. This phase of their NASA careers will last from 1.5 to 2 years. So NASA spends 2 years training its astronauts to speak Russian so they can fly on the Soyuz spacecraft. Let's go and have a look at what China's doing, right? Because, like I said, Osama bin Laden and Sad Man Who's Insane have successfully shot Americans out of manned low Earth orbit. They don't have the budget for it. And they've got to keep on the right side of Putin or they don't get to fly on Soyuz either. So, from the Americans' view of the American space program, to the British view. Red Star rising. China is on the cusp of becoming a space superpower. Phil McKenna thinks through the consequences. The first Taikonauts return to Earth after 15 days in space. They won't be the last. On the 14th of December 2013, the top trending topics on China's biggest social networks were a popular TV show and a football match. If it hadn't been for a concerted push from China's state-controlled media, the casual observer might never have noticed that China had just become the third country in the world to land on the moon. That's their Chang'e 3, or Jade Rabbit. The news was not greeted with sweeping enthusiasm. After all, landing the U-2 robotic rover, aka Jade Rabbit, on Earth's closest neighbour was a feat human explorers had bagged many decades before. Quote, "We're now only 50 years behind Russia and the USA," unquote, quipped one commentator on Weibo, China's version of Twitter. Quote, "Our country's designers have some catching up to do," unquote, wrote another, before worrying that the joke would lead to police detention. But if China seemed a little bored, that was nothing compared with the collective yawn echoing around the world. Apart from failing the latest novelty test, the mission was accomplished using knock-off equipment, and U-2 was dismissed as a tragic Me Too exercise by a country lagging decades behind the world's leading space powers. This common reaction missed the point. Jade Rabbit's successful launch, landing and exploration is evidence of China's meteoric rise in the space stakes, and one that will only accelerate. Quote, "It is a classic example of the tortoise and the hare," says Dean Cheng of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C. From the sophisticated communications network that guided the rovers to its destination, to emerging satellite technology that is the envy of other nations, to its plans for a new international space station, China is a force other space superpowers ignore at their peril. The ripples are reaching out to affect everything from your phone's settings to the first footprints on Mars. To get an idea of China's burgeoning space program, look no further than its satellites. Starting in 1970, China launched low-quality transponders and rudimentary spy satellites capable of only the most basic tasks at an entirely unimpressive rate of 1 per year. By 2012, the country had surpassed the US, with 19 launches in a single year. China had also sent its first Taikonaut into space, conducted its first spacewalk, and completed its first rendezvous and docking with a small space laboratory. Quote, "The manned program they are building is progressing a lot faster than the US did with theirs in the 60s, unquote, says Richard Holdaway, director at Rutherford, of the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory Space Division, one of the UK's closest collaborators on the Chinese space program. They are catching up at an astonishing rate. In 15 years, this is a quote, they've gone from bit player to leading player, says Jonathan McDowell of the Harvard-Smithsonian Centre for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they have done so on a shoestring. China's space budget is less than 1/10 of the US one, according to a recent estimate by the Space Foundation, a non-profit organisation based in Colorado Springs. So what accounts for the rapid acceleration? A common and not entirely charitable answer is that other nations have already solved many of the challenges. Quote, "When it was just the US and the Soviets, there were basic questions of survival like what would astronauts breathe, how much oxygen, how much nitrogen, and no one knew the answer to," says Cheng. "Today, China can benefit from much of that having been worked out and made publicly available," unquote. His words reflect the familiar attitude that China's technological progress has been built largely on the ideas of others, whether given freely or not. Quote, "We get hacked from people in China every day," Holdaway says. "Most systems are pretty robust, but some stuff gets through. Indeed, the received wisdom is that China has acquired so much intellectual property from external and sometimes unwilling sources that they may not be capable of innovation." Quote, "They are still in a developmental stage using essentially Russian technology and knockoffs," unquote, says Robert Bigelow, the founder of Bigelow Aerospace, a space technology company in Las Vegas, who's trying to sell inflatable habitats to NASA, by the way. However, on closer inspection, this picture seems incomplete. Granted, as Bigelow points out, China's Shenzhou space capsule looks nearly identical to Russia's Soyuz capsule, and beneath Chinese spacesuits, Taikonauts often wear an inner pressure suit made in Russia. And yes, Jade Rabbit looks like an updated version of Lunokhod 2, a Soviet rover that landed on the moon in 1973. Many of these similarities stem from a deal that took place in the mid-1990s when China purchased much of Russia's human spaceflight technology, including Soyuz capsules, spacesuits, life support and docking systems. However, China has made vast improvements to the original designs. For example, the Shenzhou capsule is roughly 30% larger, with solar panels, advanced avionics and electronics. Quote, China has developed what the next generation would have been, unquote, says Leroy Chow, a former US astronaut. But the Americans are still buying seats on the old Russian stuff. Other crucial improvements, however, are not incremental. China has leaped ahead of other countries thanks to basic science. For example, to operate a rover successfully on the moon, Chinese engineers had to make it impervious to lunar soil, an incredibly sharp, fine-grained and sticky substance that nearly scuttled the Apollo missions. To test rover prototypes without advice from countries with access to fake moon dust, Chinese scientists developed their own simulated lunar soil from scratch. They did it using only a tiny sample of moon rock acquired decades earlier from the US, says Yongcheng Zhen, a planetary scientist at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. China's rocket technology has a similar tale to tell. Its Long March rockets are an original design and quickly became more advanced than Russian rockets, which have changed very little over the years, relying primarily on kerosene, a low-powered but easy-to-use fuel source. The Long March 3, which sent the Jade Rabbit on its path to the moon, uses a more advanced hydrazine and dinitrogen tetroxide fuel. Quote, it's something the Russians have tended to stay away from, says McDowell. It has more oomph, but it's harder to work with, unquote. He refers to the Chinese success with this fuel as a high-tech achievement. And so, thanks to these and other rapid advances in China's space program, Jade Rabbit spent 6 weeks mapping lunar regolith before an equipment malfunction froze it in its tracks. This week, the end of lunar night will reveal whether the rover survived. If space was simply about moon rovers, the story might end there, but China has also been busy elsewhere developing a full suite of systems including software, satellites and communications infrastructure with the goal of total space independence. To communicate with its probes on previous lunar orbiting missions, for example, the country relied heavily on the European Space Agency's global deep space antenna network, but not for much longer perhaps. Quote, the Chinese are building up their own network, says ESA's Carl Bergquist. There is less necessity to rely on us. For the Jade Rabbit mission, China still used both networks but depended less on ESAs. Satellite navigation is in the middle of a similar overhaul. China is a little less than halfway done with Beidou, its answer to the GPS satellite navigation system. As of today, 15 navigation satellites are in orbit with plans for 20 more by 2020. Indeed, satellite technology is where the country really shines. In 2010, China demonstrated its capacity for precision manoeuvrability when 2 satellites appeared to rendezvous and briefly touch before continuing on their separate ways. Quote, it's one thing to simply come screaming in at high speed and bounce off or destroy the other, says Cheng, but to come in, nudge something and back off is indicative of very high-end technology and very highly advanced skill sets, unquote. A satellite this sophisticated could repair other ageing satellites to stop them becoming space junk, or help assemble a space station. Indeed, a second space lab will be in low Earth orbit by 2015, placed there by the next generation Long March 5 rocket, capable of lifting 600 kilograms more than the now retired US Space Shuttle. A full-scale Chinese space station, CSS, will join it by 2020. A report published by the Chinese Academy of Sciences spells out China's next steps, which include a crewed lunar base, CREWED, crewed lunar base, a goal Holdaway considers reasonable, a human mission to Mars and robotic planetary exploration by 2050. For a country that has yet to set foot on lunar soil, such projections may seem unrealistic, but China's long and persistent march is not the only reason to believe the roadmap. The country also possesses at least two resources no other country can compete with. The first is people. Quote, "250,000 people are working on their space program," says Holdaway. Unquote. "And these scientists and engineers are young," says Gregory Kulaki, China expert at the Union of Concerned Scientists based in Washington, D.C. Echoing the idealistic young NASA culture of the 1960s, he says, quote, "The average is in the low 30s, which is 20 years younger than other countries' programs." End quote. Another key to China's present and future success is the unique ability granted by the one-party rule to stick to their plans longer than the political cycles of most Western governments. Quote, "The Chinese have a long-term plan and they're willing to devote resources to it," says Cheng. "I don't mean just money, I mean human resources, industrial resources and political resources. Eventually we should expect they will surpass us." Unquote. But perhaps the most important catalyst for Chinese innovation was being frozen out of international collaboration. The US strictly forbids their scientists, astronauts and aerospace contractors from collaborating with China in space, citing concerns that the country would co-opt any shared technology, and being barred from sending astronauts to the US-led International Space Station, ISS, led China to develop its Chinese space station. Similar examples abound. It was only after the European Union ended Chinese participation in the Galileo project, the European rival to GPS, that China began working on Beidou in earnest. Its exclusion from the party also accounts for much of China's rapid advancement in satellite development, access to which has been most heavily restricted by other countries. They decided to rely on their own technology, Kulaki says. They have advanced faster because of the sanctions. Right? When the Americans decided that they were at the top of the space tree and they could lock everybody else out, that's what caused China to suddenly get so good as the Americans fade away. Global effects. And even as China is busy developing its capacity in space, the abilities of existing space powers are on the way. Quote, "It is not clear that the United States' rate of technological improvement will continue as you look 10 to 20 years out into the future," unquote, McDowell says. He cites budget cuts, political gridlock and failing educational systems. Much existing US and European space infrastructure is also ageing. To hedge its bets, ESA is now, that's European Space Agency, is now positioning itself to partner with China in human spaceflight. Quote, "We have currently 3 or 4 astronauts and astronaut trainers who are in language training, learning Chinese," says ESA's human spaceflight director Thomas Reiber. Quote, "We are taking steps to intensify our links with the Chinese Space Agency." Unquote. But what's in it for China? After decades of being shut out of collaboration, Cheng says China may be at a point where it would prefer to continue going it alone. Quote, "It's not at all a given that China wants to cooperate with us. Given the US hiatus on manned spaceflight, it's not at all clear what we would bring to the table," he says. Collaboration with Russia may be equally unattractive. In 2011, Russia launched a Chinese space probe to Mars as part of its Phobos Grunt mission, or Phobos Grunt, I think it's pronounced. But the Russian spacecraft never made it out of Earth's orbit. Quote, "From the Chinese perspective, it was a high-visibility, high-prestige project that failed because of the Russians," Cheng says. Indeed, the shifting balance of space powers could have all manner of unexpected consequences. The Pentagon recently acknowledged that the US military command in Africa now relies on a Chinese satellite for communications, reflecting the military's ever larger appetite for bandwidth, which has surged in recent years as it relies increasingly on remotely operated drones and satellite radio communications. For the same reason, many commercial applications will benefit from Chinese satellite development, such as smartphones, which can already access both GPS and its Russian alternative GLONASS as a backup. Baidu would offer a third option. While GPS is robust, it has been vulnerable to jamming, causing chaos at airports from San Francisco to New Jersey and leading to widespread concerns about over-reliance on the system. A significant number of car manufacturers are also reportedly equipping their systems to access Beidou in case of GPS failure. Then there's the US's ageing weather satellite infrastructure, a topic subject to annual congressional hand-wringing. Last year, a controversial government report found that the agency's best alternative would be to turn to China for help. But these are not the only ways China's space dominance could affect the world. For one thing, it might motivate other countries to reinvest in their languishing space programs. On the 9th of January, shortly after the Jade Rabbit landing, the US administration announced at a space conference that funding for the ISS would continue for 4 additional years. While McDowell doubts that the landing has had anything to do with the decision, officials could well have cancelled the ageing space station's $3 billion a year funding. Chow is sure that the spectre of the Chinese space station influenced the decision not to can the funding. Quote, "There was a threat that we were going to sit on the sidelines as all of our partners go over and start working with China," unquote, he says. But perhaps the most utopian consequence of China's space ambitions would be a renewed realisation that space is not divided according to national boundaries. At the same forum, US Deputy Secretary of State William J. Burns announced an international space roadmap aiming to unite the separate paths of the national space agencies. Quote, "It didn't say except China," says Chow, noting that this is a subtle but significant departure from normal. The roadmap, Burns told the Assembly, would create realistic prospects for long-shot projects commonly considered too expensive for individual governments to undertake, such as human missions to the surface of Mars and an asteroid defence shield. In any case, none of this can happen without China, says Holdaway. Quote, "My educated guess is that the US, which can't afford to go to Mars on its own any more than the ESA can, will initiate some dialogue with China about a global human mission." End quote, he says. Stranger things have happened. Chow points out that US cooperation with Russia was thought similarly unthinkable right up until the moment that it happened. Well, we shall see. From that to this, that seems to be a waning, tapering, ebbing flow. Whereas China's moon seems to be waxing rather than waning. Watch this space, eh? We all may get to live by the light of a communist moon, regardless of American wibnifery. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.